In our last lesson, we looked at the Boston Tea Party, and it became the turning point. In London, even colony supporters were appalled. Think about it this way. Up until this point, there had been some people in London who were very concerned about disciplining the colonies. But there were also people who were more moderate and had been saying the colonies have a point. But after the Boston Tea Party, it became more difficult to argue on behalf of the colonists. British law highly valued and preserved private property. This act in Boston had been a type of terrorism. The British Prime Minister, Lord North, had no choice but to react swiftly and strongly, and Britain was united. In the colonies, there was also some confusion over this issue. Benjamin Franklin famously said, "The colonies have to pay that back." So, the Boston Tea Party really was the turning point. Now, Parliament responded by passing the Coercive Acts. Coercive means to convince somebody to do something. And what Parliament thought it was doing was convincing the colonies to behave. The Coercive Acts were passed in 1774. Interestingly, the colonies called this the Intolerable Acts, because to them, these acts were not coercive at all. They were, in fact, the opposite. They were intolerable. The acts included 5 different parts. The first part was about Boston Port. The Boston Port would be closed until the tea was repaid. And by closed, Britain meant this. British warships would be in Boston Harbor and would block any other ships from docking. Now, at this time, Boston was probably the most active harbor in North America. So this was a major action. The Coercive Acts also closed the Massachusetts government. It ended the General Assembly. It also made it so that the king would appoint all positions in Massachusetts. And also, it made it so that peaceful assembly was allowed only once per year, and non-peaceful assembly was never allowed. General Gage moved into Massachusetts to keep martial law. The Administration of Justice Act was also part of the Coercive Acts. They required trials on British soldiers and officers to be held in London. Now recall that there had been a trial just a couple years earlier because of the Boston Massacre. That trial had occurred in Boston. But according to this new act, any activities by British soldiers and officers that resulted in a trial would be carried out in London. George Washington famously called this the Murder Act because he said it would let the British soldiers get away with murder. The fourth part of the Coercive Acts was a reaffirmation of the Quartering Act. Any soldiers in Boston or New York or anywhere else, those soldiers would have to be quartered by the American colonists. And then finally, the fifth action was an affirmation of Catholic prerogative in Quebec. You'll recall that Quebec was a Canadian province, that Canada had formerly been French, and that most of its people were Catholic. The 13 colonies weren't so keen on all those Catholics. And so when Britain said, yes, they can remain Catholic, some of the colonies found that offensive. So it was the turning point. As a result of these intolerable acts, Americans were shocked that Parliament thought it could so drastically alter things just by its whim. It could cancel governments. It could close ports. It could set taxes. It could even change law and make it so that trials weren't allowed in the colonies, but only trials in London. Colonists began to think, if they could change all that just according to the whim, is there no end to this? Many of these acts were seen as the end of American freedom. Even American moderates could no longer defend Parliament. If this happened to Massachusetts, it could happen to anyone. So in June 1774, those acts went into law, and all up and down the colonies, people reacted. They observed the day with fasting and prayer, the tolling of mournful bells, and flags at half-mast with homes draped in funeral mourning. The colonies were slowly becoming united, and the First Continental Congress was called to determine the next steps. My main point in this lesson is to realize that the Boston Tea Party united both sides of the Atlantic. The British became united against the Americans, and the Americans became united against the British. Even the moderates that had existed on both sides could no longer voice their opinions. Thus, the Boston Tea Party radically increased the polarization of both sides.